Good evening. This is Pastor Mike from Leavittsburg Baptist Church, and this is the Wednesday night service for October 21st, 2020. And tonight we're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. And I think it's interesting that a lot of times we use phrases in our modern vernacular, and as we use these phrases, we don't really understand where they came from. I've always known where the phrase "the handwriting on the wall" came from, but that's because I went to church not all the time, but quite a bit when I was younger, and I remember hearing the account of Daniel and the handwriting on the wall. And so this is really where that phrase comes from. And the handwriting on the wall always indicates that there's an end to something. Something is ending. We say, well, there's handwriting on the wall. We have an election coming up, and both sides are saying the handwriting's on the wall. The incumbent side is saying the handwriting's on the wall. It's going to end this challenge, and to what we're doing, that the country wants us to continue. The challenger is saying the handwriting's on the wall. The country doesn't want what's happening now to continue, so they're going to. The challenger will be elected, and the handwriting's on the wall for the president or the senator or the congressman or whoever is being elected. But it always means the end of something. And Daniel chapter 5 is where this comes from. And it introduces to us, Daniel chapter 5 really introduces to us a new king. This new king, it says, beginning of verse 1, it says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought to the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple and the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, and of silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And so we see a new king, and this new king has a new attitude. He has the idea of just partying all the time. That's actually all we see him do in the book of Daniel is party. And admittedly, this is just one chapter, but it's a significant chapter that's what we see this king doing. It doesn't seem like it's something that's abnormal. He just wanted to party with his lords and his wives and his concubines. And so they're there with thousands of people and they're partying. And really, he shows an utter disregard for the temple and for God. He's disrespectful of the God of Daniel, of the God of Judah, and he dishonors God. It says, so he goes in and he gets these vessels. He's drunk and he thinks, well, what should we do? Hey, let's go grab all these temple vessels and we will drink our alcohol out of this and we'll party and do what we do at these parties in front of this, and we're going to worship our gods of stone and precious metals that we have carved out, and gods of wood that we've carved out. We're going to go ahead and we're going to do this. And so he not just dishonored the temple treasures, but he also disrespected God. And God will never allow himself to be disrespected for too long. And they worshipped idols. They used the holy, sacred relics, the sacred vessels of the temple, to worship their idols. And God could not abide that. And so here we see the handwriting on the wall. As soon as they started partying like this, they got those temple vessels, and the king and his lords and his concubines and his wives started drinking out of these vessels. We see this written here. It says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster on the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. So it's there where everyone can see it. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his knees knocked together. As the thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring the enchanters and the Chaldeans and the astrologers. And so here's the king, and he sees this handwriting on the wall, and he immediately he begins to fear. His color changed. I mean, he went pale. He went white as a sheet from fear. He lost his strength. His knees started to buckle. His knees were knocking. He had no strength. And so he calls out as loud as he could for the wise men of the kingdom, the astrologers and the enchanters and the Chaldeans to come to interpret what is written on this wall. Because this stuff written on the wall, it is a new language. It's a language that he doesn't understand. We don't know what the language is. The Bible doesn't tell us. But it's clear that of all these thousands of people, it's likely that all the languages were represented, that all these people would, at least someone would have familiarity with other languages and the languages in the known world, and yet none of this was written in that language. So it could be a language that God made specifically for this event. It could be maybe it's the language that existed before the scrambling of the tongues. We don't know. But the king summons the wise men, and he offers them this. He offers them this bribe. Really, he says this reward. He said, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple, which would be a very expensive robe, and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom." So there will only be two below the king. And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. So all these wise men of all these people, none of them could read the writing. No one knew what the language was. No one knew what it said. They couldn't tell him what the interpretation was. And the king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and the lords were perplexed. So the king, his alarm increased after this, because these are wise men. These are the wisest men in the kingdom, and they don't know what's happening. They don't know what's happened. They don't understand this language. They can't interpret it. But fortunately for the king, he has a queen who has some measure of wisdom, who understands the history of Babylon a little bit better. It says in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O Lord, O king, live forever." And so she comes in. She's heard what's happened. She comes in, and she greets the king with a standard greeting of flattery. "O king, live forever." So she says, "Let not your thoughts alarm you. Don't let your thoughts stress you out, or your color change. Don't be so afraid that you lose your color." It says, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." She says, listen, there's a man in your kingdom. He's already in the kingdom, and in him is the spirit of the holy gods. Now she, being pagan and idolatrous, believes in many gods, and so she believes that all these gods have endued this man with great gifts. But we know that this man is gifted, because he's gifted of God, the Most High God, the God of heaven, the God that we serve. And he's been given these wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And let me get back here. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So she said, listen, there's a man in the kingdom, and in him is an excellent spirit. In him is a wisdom of God. and he can show you this interpretation. We know this because of what he did for Nebuchadnezzar, that there is no one found who could interpret dreams, who had the wisdom, who could solve problems like Daniel. And you need to call Daniel because he can tell you what the interpretation is. So the king then calls Daniel. And we see the king offering Daniel some flattery and some bribes when he arrives. Look at what it says here. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom." So here he is, and he says, "Listen, I've heard about you, Daniel." He acts like he knows all about Daniel, that he's heard this, but it's pretty clear that if he'd heard anything about Daniel, he completely forgot it. He says, he flatters them, "I've heard there's an excellent spirit in you, that the wisdom of gods are in you, and if you will just tell me what this interpretation is of what's on this wall," he said, "I will give you honor, and I will give you wealth, and I will make you the third ruler in the kingdom." And I love Daniel's response. And Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." So Daniel says, "Listen, I don't want any part of your gifts." It's interesting that Daniel didn't respond that way to Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar asked him for an interpretation. Again, Daniel seemed to have a genuine affection for Nebuchadnezzar, and he seems to lack that same affection for Belshazzar. He comes to him, and he's not very courteous. He's very direct and really pretty, almost borderline rude here to him. He said, "You just keep your gifts. I don't want any part of them, but I'll tell you the interpretation." And so here's Daniel as he recounts Nebuchadnezzar's experience. Beginning in 18, "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will." So here's Daniel, and he says, "Listen," he says, "your father, the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, he was a great man. God gave him this kingdom. He gave him power and authority, and whoever he wanted dead was killed, and whoever he wanted to keep alive was kept alive, and the people he wanted to raise up, he raised up, and people he wanted to humble, he humbled." And as great as Nebuchadnezzar was, and he's recounting what happened in Daniel chapter 4, when his heart got swelled up with pride, God humbled him. He had him driven from among people. He grazed like an oxen in the field until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign and puts people in authority, whoever he chooses. And we see that. And then remember, if you remember, in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar makes this declaration that anyone who speaks against God, let me read it to you directly. Let's see. Actually, it wasn't last chapter. It was chapter 4. It was actually chapter 3. Sorry about that. He says, verse 28, chapter 3, verse 28, after the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has set his angels to deliver his servants who trusted him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks against anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, their houses laid in ruin, for there is no God who is able to rescue in this way. And so King Nebuchadnezzar made this declaration. This King Belshazzar, he apparently has forgotten everything that happened in Nebuchadnezzar. He forgot about the dream that Daniel had to tell the king what the dream was and then interpret it. He forgot about the fiery furnace. He forgot about what happened to Nebuchadnezzar and being humbled for 7 years and grazing like cattle. And that's something that, again, that a son, an immediate son, would have remembered about his father. I know I would remember if my father spent 7 years grazing in the field like cattle, like a cow. But Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, didn't remember that. And so, again, it's likely that it was his grandson and not his son. But nevertheless, Daniel really rebukes him. And he says this. He says, And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. He'd been educated in all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and of bronze, iron and wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And so we see here that, in spite of all this, the education, certainly he'd been taught this, but a lot of times when we're disconnected from history, we forget what we're taught because we didn't experience it, we didn't see it. But he forgot all this. And not only, he wasn't like Nebuchadnezzar, whose heart was filled with pride. He actually raised up against, he basically assaulted God by dishonoring the temple vessels. And he raised his fist to God, and he refused to honor God. And God will not be dishonored for long before he takes action. And so Daniel then addresses the king's concerns. In spite of the fact that he doesn't really respect this king, he addresses it. He's going to tell him the interpretation. He says that from his presence, the hand was sent. From the very presence of God, God himself sent this hand to write on this writing on the wall. And he wrote, the writing was inscribed, was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. He says Mene, Mene. He says it twice, re-emphasizing, listen, your kingdom is over. That's it. You're done. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and been found wanting. He said, we've weighed the value of your kingdom, and there is no value here. You are without value. I mean, that's a hard thing to say to anyone, let alone a king. for a king to be told you have no value. And then Perez or parson, he says, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. He says, listen, your kingdom is over. You've been found wanting. There is nothing valuable here. There's nothing redeemable here, and your kingdom is over. And the king of the Medes and the Persians are going to have your kingdom. Now, in spite of that bad interpretation, which most of the time you went to a pagan king and give him bad news, they just wanted to kill you. I don't think Belshazzar really took this too seriously. He might have thought, yeah, this is going to happen eventually, but he didn't seem to take it all that seriously. And it says in verse 29, it says, and Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put about his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he was giving luxury, he was given authority. It's interesting, though, that it's not the same level of authority that Nebuchadnezzar had given him previously. He was the second in the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar only, and yet now he's made third in the kingdom. He'd apparently been removed from government altogether, and so the king gives him this promotion. Now, this is probably the shortest promotion in the history of mankind, because the Bible tells us in verse 31 and 32, that night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so here we go, that Belshazzar, that night, he promotes Daniel. Later that night, he is killed. The Medes attack. They take over Babylon. And the tradition has it, historically, what we see, not in Scripture, but in other historical references, is that they used the river that fed their wealth. And they went in, and there were metal cages in there to prevent the enemy from using it. But they were able to divert the water while the king was partying, while all the lords were partying, divert the water enough to where they could go in and they could actually get through the iron that they had, not having to be underwater, and went in and took over the kingdom at that point. And so this is one of the last historical accounts we have of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, we have really just one more chapter, the next chapter, that deals with Daniel in the lion's den, another familiar account. And then we get into a lot of the prophecy of Daniel, prophecy of future things yet to come. Some have been fulfilled, some yet to be fulfilled. But, God judged Belshazzar for not honoring him, not just not honoring him, but for raising up his hand. God takes his honor very seriously. And as believers, we need to make sure that we're honoring God, that we're worshiping God. And worshiping God is more than just singing songs or playing good music. It's more than just reading your Bible. It's more than just praying. But part of worshiping God and praising God and giving him the honor due him is sharing testimonies. We need to share our testimonies. What has God done in our lives? We allot time in our services to do that, and we need to really make better use of that. We need to honor God and worship him by sharing testimonies outside of church. We need to share testimonies with one another. We should be sharing with people, both in the church and outside the church, how we got saved. What was our salvation experience? And we should never be ashamed of telling people or even asking people how they got saved and what transpired when they got saved. And yet, too often, we consider that something that's private, and when really it should be a public thing, that we share that and let people know who we were before Christ and how God and how Jesus Christ has changed our lives. And that's all really part of honoring God. And I hope and I pray that we will honor God as we go through our days, and that we will not just resolve to honor God because we heard this message and do it for a little while, but that we'll do it for the rest of our lives. May God richly bless you as you serve him.